Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Art at Noon Backstory. I'm so glad all of you are here. As many of you know, our Backstory series takes us behind the scenes of art, music, and literature. We invite writers, composers, directors, creators to share their stories, their inspirations, and their challenges, and unexpected moments that perhaps shape their work. And today we have a wonderful program. We're delighted to welcome Jonathan Rich, author of Spires in the Sun. Jonathan's books beautifully explore Florida's Carpenter Gothic churches, their history, their architecture, and the communities that built them. Many of you have visited these churches with us on our road trips and art walks, and you know just how deeply they all speak, these buildings do, to Florida's heritage. Our own St. Mary's in Green Cove Springs, my hometown, is featured in the book, and it makes just today extremely special for me. So we have joining with us today too. Bill, how do you say your last name? I don't want to.
You talking to me?
Yeah, yeah. How do you say your last name?
Mishbach.
Ashbach. Okay. Phil Ashbach, and is the photographer whose stunning images really bring the spires and the sun to life. And he's also joining us today. And we're so happy to have you, Phil. So let's lean back and get comfortable. And we'll be talking about the origins of this book, perhaps the research behind it, the site visits, the stories that were uncovered, the architectural passions, perhaps, that fuel both of these guys' work. And of course, this creative process that brought all of this beautiful, beautiful book together. So thank you for being here. And let's welcome Jonathan and Phil. Hey, John.
Thank you, Sandy.
Good afternoon. Well, first of all, we're going to get started because we want to just dig deep into your background, Jonathan. I do have the IRS report here, so I just want you to know that.
In that case, I'm signing off.
I'm just telling you, so just be upfront and honest with us, okay? So just kind of go over your early life, Uh, tell us a little bit about where you grew up, uh, what places in your life perhaps shaped you, maybe teachers, faith leaders, uh, and did you have any connection to a church community growing up?
Sure, I'd be happy to, Sandy. Like Phil, my collaborator on the book, who did all the photography, I was born in Florida. I'm a Florida native. And also, like him, I'm a cradle Episcopalian. And then finally, like him, I've had the good fortune to travel a great deal. And as we grew up, we lived, and I'm just going to mention places where we lived more than a year, here in Winter Park, New York City, Ann Arbor, Michigan, uh, a little village outside of Athens, Greece, um, a village in Switzerland for 3 years, a year in Paris, a year in another village in France. So why do I mention that? I mention it because I think that background for me, as well as for Phil, probably exposed us a little bit more to this particular architectural idiom. I'm referring to the Gothic, not the Carpenter Gothic, but just the Gothic idiom generally. And I didn't have that perception until recently. But you wonder how you arrived at certain things, and that may be one of the reasons why this particular form spoke to us. Those three reasons, I think: the fact that we're traveled, we've lived elsewhere, we're cradled Episcopalians, and we're native Floridians.
They all
But
had a lot. How'd you two guys meet?
we met as neighbors, as I recall, possibly on the tennis court, but I think as neighbors. We both lived on Chelton Circle, which overlooks Chelton Pond in Winter Park. Our children were the same ages. They played together. So we were neighbors for for years. And I think I acquired an awareness that Phil had these traits in common with me, this background in common with me, but probably was only dimly aware of the extent of his knowledge of Florida history. And I myself had delved into Florida history on an amateur basis, but a fairly studied basis, and really got into Florida's natural history as well, and made forays into the Everglades and the Fakahatchee Strand and the Florida Trail. And I remember reaching a point on my in my early work on the book, and I think I was about 7 years in, but didn't have that much to show for it. When I ran into Phil at the Winter Park Post Office, and by then I had concluded that while I enjoyed my own photographs of the churches and the stained glass windows, um, I recognized that having a professional architectural photographer do the work would be preferable. And of course, I knew that that was Phil's career, that he was an architectural photographer and a travel photographer. And so when I ran into him at the post office, I just popped the question. He had come to my mind, and I said, "Look, I don't think there's anything in this financially. In fact, we're probably going to pay as we share gas and maybe hotels and things of that sort as we travel around the state. Is there any chance you'd be interested? I don't expect you to answer now, but maybe think it over." Well, he answered on the spot, and we spoke for about 45 minutes about the esoterics of uh, Melrose and Madison and Milton and Monticello. I could keep going with the M's, I think. But those are parts of Florida that most people don't know a lot about, if they know about them at all. And for a moment, I felt as though we had become two twins raised in a closet in New York who had developed their own private language. We really got going, and it stayed that way. And it was just really refreshing to be able to ask someone or talk to somebody about Benjamin Putnam or Jim Burt or George Fairbanks without having to explain who those people were, or to talk about the significance of Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, or I still pronounce it the old way, or other personalities like Harriet Beecher Stowe, who created one of these Carpenter Gothic churches in Mandarin. So imagine if I had traveled with a photographer who didn't know any of those things, no matter what her or his talents might have been, that would have been a pretty big gap to bridge. And that was never necessary. So it was a perfect collaboration.
It would have been lonely too, right, Phil?
It would have been. It would have been. But we had the common ground appropriate to the work. And that leads me to make a point which surfaces again and again. There were times when we were dealt setbacks, sometimes fairly significant ones, but often the path would be cleared and a better alternative would present itself. And there were times when it was abundantly clear that there was another hand in this. There was a kind of a guiding hand other than our own that was making it possible to tell this story. We were very struck by that, and not really prepared to have seen that in advance, but there it was.
Okay, so let's talk about how you kind of came into this yourself as the writer. Okay. Um, your background that led you into this, maybe touch on your academic career, your path, or and just a tidbit of this arc of bringing you to to do this pretty momentous book. I mean, it's thick, Phil. You know, it's thick, Jonathan, for both of y'all. It's a pretty book. Okay.
It's it's a big book, as our publisher put it several times.
Well, how
And he meant more than its heft. He meant that it had footnotes, it had a fairly detailed index, it had photography, it had layout challenges, it had all kinds of things. Um, well, in terms of the path that led to the writing of the book, um, I um, I mentioned a past as an Episcopalian, going all the way back to the English Reformation. My my paternal grandfather was an Episcopal priest. His father, my great grandfather, was also an Episcopal priest, and I had a fairly I had a background that was fairly steeped in the Episcopal tradition. I went to an Episcopal boarding school, Holderness School in New Hampshire. Phil went to Swanee, so again you see that commonality. Um, and Then had the good fortune to become a lawyer. I did transactional work. I did not do litigation. And I mention that because it involved me with the written word a fair amount. Although legal writing, it must be said, is a lot different than the kind of writing that one embarks on in producing a book of this sort. And indeed, I found that I had to unlearn a lot of my habits, and that took a lot of effort and a lot of time. I could not write a book that seemed um, legalese, and the temptation to use little devices that lawyers use, like using such, to refer back to something earlier in the sentence. That just does not work. So there was that. But then, how did I become aware of the churches? Well, as I mentioned in the books afterward, it's a little bit like being asked, "What's your first memory of your mother?" Um, there was never a time when Phil and I weren't aware at some level of these churches. His childhood church over in Cocoa was one of these churches, later covered with a stucco facade, but nevertheless one of these churches. That's St. Mark's in Cocoa. My church, All Saints Episcopal Church in Winter Park, was one of these churches. Now, by the time I was born, it had been replaced by one done by Ralph Adams Cram, very beautiful Gothic revival church in its own right, but different architecture because it's not in wood. Um, but those influences, I'm sure, accrued and left their mark. And as I grew up, I became aware that there were others still surviving in strong semblance of their original condition. And those would be Good Shepherd in Maitland, not far from where I grew up, Christ Church in Longwood. But then when I was 15 years old, I took a trip from Sanford up the St. Johns River to Jacksonville and then down the Intracoastal Waterway. And I think in the book I said I was 16. That was an error. I was actually 15. My mom let me go on one condition, and to this day it's a little embarrassing to have to admit it. And that condition was that I take her along with me. So I went with a friend who was also 15, but my mom, to her credit, came along with us. And up the river we went. We spent the first night at uh, at what is now Blue Spring State Park. It was then a fishing camp. It was still privately owned. And we stayed in a fishing shack on stilts out in the spring run. But the next day we saw Emmanuel Wallacka because we stayed in Wallacka overnight at the old Sportsman's Lodge, which no longer exists. And then later on we saw your church, Sandy, there in Green Cove Springs, right on the water. And I was struck by the fact that there was a string of these churches. There were a number of churches in this style. Why did they have the traits in common that they had? And I guess that question was in the back of my mind in my adult years. And then one day, my wife and I, probably still in our 20s, maybe our late 20s, were driving back from the beach, New Smyrna Beach. We had my dad in the car with us. We arrived in Osteen, and the children were asleep, conked out in the back seat, as children will be after the beach. And my dad said, "Why don't you take a right? I'd like to show you a church." We took a right. And we went to Enterprise there, a little town of Enterprise on the north shore of Lake Monroe, and pulled into the parking lot, a quiet, shaded parking lot of of All Saints Enterprise, and there it stood, little white Carpenter Gothic church under live oaks. And I think it's accurate to say that in the car we just sort of fell into awestruck wonder just at the sight of it, and that has stayed with me, that impression. And so maybe the kernel, the seed, was planted at that time. But I was maybe, I said 20s, maybe 30, maybe 33. Um, and then years later, in 2005, I remember where I was standing at the banister of our house in Boone, North Carolina, and it just came over me. But why not a book? Why and if a book, why not me? Phil and I have been struck by the fact that Florida, as I like to put it, has not exactly been ignored by writers or photographers for that matter. In fact, I don't think there are many states that have been more chronicled by writers and photographers. Swamps, alligators, beaches, Art Deco, uh, Mediterranean revival architecture, lighthouses, shipwrecks. And I always like to say at this point that there's at least one book still in print about Florida's indigenous tree snails, but nobody had ever written a book about these churches. So we uh, we decided to do it, and we lived in terror of the possibility that somebody else might beat us to publication with a book of this type. That, as it turned out, didn't happen, but didn't keep us from having a few sleepless nights about the possibility.
Well, kind of combining a couple of questions here too. I think you've talked about your faith journey, kind of, you know, with this book, and of course, a long line of priest in your family. Um, but let's talk about just a minute. What kind, before you started all of this as a lawyer, okay, and you talked about that. Of course, lawyers have marvelous research capabilities. They have to. Was this what type of research before you started this? Did you do any research at all into any of these churches? Say, okay, this is what these are the ones I'm going to take. Did they just kind of fall out of the trees for you? Or do people come up to you and say, do you know you need to go to this one? What kind of arc were you using in order to kind of grapple with this?
Well, I would love to be able to say, I would dearly love to be able to say that it was all very neat and organized and programmatic and carefully thought through. But it was actually very messy. The proverbial sausage making comes to mind. I don't say that about Phil's work, but about my own. Um, I wrote a sentence, tore it up. I picked up that sentence for a long time, but eventually tore it up. Wrote pages, tore them up, thought about, what would this look like? And how would it be organized? And a lot of challenges presented themselves. Um, what churches to include, what churches to exclude. And in the end, we came up with a number of filters. One was that the churches had to still survive. We made one exception for Harriet Beecher Stowe's church. Another filter, they had to be in a reasonable approximation of their original form. If they had been dramatically changed, uh, beautiful as they might have been, compelling as they might be today, we had to exclude them. The book is big already, and we had to circumscribe it. There was just no choice but to circumscribe it. What other filters? Um, the church had to have had some preservation of its history. Most did, but one or two, had a fairly thin early history. And I wanted early history. I realized I could not write or even summarize the entire parish history. The parishes have done that very well themselves, sometimes creating books on the subject to rival the size of ours. So there was no summarizing the history. I thought it would be more interesting for readers to learn about how these churches came into being, who dreamt them, who did the fundraising for them, who oversaw their construction, who nourished their early lives and saw to it that they were fitted with stained glass and furnishings and so forth. So that was the area of concentration. But it was tough doing all these things, and even in midstream, even as I worked with Phil, we were making very momentous decisions about the book. One was the decision to go from only 14 churches on the St. Johns River, broadly understood because it included one that's on Jacksonville Beach, um, to 39 churches in Florida. And the cha-ching of that, the realization that that meant years more of work, 5, 7 years, and a prolongation of the fear that somebody would, get to the mark before we did, was really pretty extraordinary. And Phil can confirm that I was resistant because I knew how much work that would be. It was really, really daunting. I also knew that I would have to scrap some of what I had done because I had enough for a book already with 14 churches. It meant I would have to compress the size of the chapters on those churches in order to make room for that many more.
Right. Okay, so we've kind of touched on this, the research process, but being a librarian and an information specialist, that's always just, I just love that. I love looking up stuff. And I know that you had to have, and I don't, we can kind of talk about the process. You've hit on it, but I really want you to hit on it this time. What was your process in researching these books? What primary sources did you use? Um, did interviews, documents from the churches? Just kind of give us an idea of how you, where you went about finding all the stuff.
It's a great question. The answer is that I began in 2006 to visit the churches. I took my camera with me, and the first thing I did was take pictures, introduce myself. I took notes. The pictures were, uh, it, in a sense, ambitious because I thought I might wind up doing this project. I didn't even dare call it a book on my own. I imagined if I failed to get it published, then I could at least turn everything over to the University of Florida or Rollins College um, for possible use by somebody else in the future. Um, of course, I met with rectors, assistant rectors. I met with diocesan historiographers, Beatrice Wilder, in the case of the Diocese of Central Florida, much revered, worked, I think, until she was nearly 100. She turned her files over to me, which was terrific. Um, I got information from all kinds of sources. The internet, of course, was increasingly of use, and I say that because the first work on this church project began 20 years ago, I guess. Um, Interviews with vestry members at the churches and historians in the communities. We talked with the local museums and historical societies. It was really quite a varied process. I can't think of many sources that weren't used, letters in some cases. Um, but getting at all that was really hard, and that makes me want to touch on a central point. If I had advice for anybody undertaking a book of this type, it would be to try to find a trove of information somewhere that nobody else had tapped and use it. And let me illustrate what I'm meaning. Um, if I were to write a book about a week in Eleanor Roosevelt's adult life, I could probably find out what she was wearing for breakfast if I wanted to. I could really go anywhere I wanted, I think, because she was famous in her own time, and her every doing was recorded once she became famous. That is not the case with these churches. And I often felt like the competitors on that cooking show, Chopped, where they open the basket of ingredients that they have to use, and there might be a quail, and there might be some exotic tropical fruit, and there might there's always at least one mystery or puzzling ingredient that they are saddled with, and often they don't have the ingredients they wanted. They just have the ingredients they're stuck with. I had the ingredients I was stuck with. And there were times when that was fabulously frustrating. How do you meld these particular ingredients into a coherent story? How do you make it interesting? How do you use everything that you're provided without seeming it unnatural to move from the quail to the tropical fruit? I mean, that was one of the hardest aspects of doing this. Whether we succeeded is for others to judge, but it was it was a real challenge to do that. The information came over the course of time. There was a lot of going back to the churches, both for the research and for the photography. I can't tell you how many times we would hear, "Oh, we might have some information of the kind that you're seeking, but I think that Aunt Vester might have that in her attic. Is Aunt Vester still with us? Is there any chance we could get it from her attic?" And the next thing we'd know, we might be and this happened, at a home on the St. Johns River with mullet, jumping in the air outside, and a woman who is leaving for Europe the next day is running her home photocopier, which is literally smoking, and creating copies of absolutely vital documents that we never knew existed, and we were, prizing and very grateful to have. So I mean that with a few sketches, might describe the challenges. There were challenges on that order for Phil. We'd arrive at a church, and the altar window would be removed. It would be out for 6 months for restoration. Well, he can't photograph the church for a book like this with the altar window missing. We would have to go back. That happened time and again. The azaleas in front of the church would not only not be in bloom, they might be dead. And of course, for a book like this, nobody wants dead azaleas in the front. So we'd have to go back, or it would be overcast or blustery, and you can see that we often had to go back. So there were many road trips to the churches.
Well, just on that same line, which of the churches that you remember had the richest documentation for you? Was there one specific one that you just say, "Oh, thank you," or that I don't have to? Because it sounds like to me in certain areas you may had to have reconstructed some history along the lines just to fill in some of those gaps. So was there one particular church that just was beaming with mullet?
Yes, there were a few. One example would be Emmanuel Episcopal Church. They are all Episcopal churches in Willaca. And there I had the good fortune, as other historians have had, to have access to the letters written between Octavia Louisa Bryant Stevens, Tivy Stevens, and her husband Winston during the Civil War. Those have been compiled and excerpted for the book, familiar probably to many of you, titled "The Rose Cottage Chronicles." And that was my treasure trove for that church. It was a lot harder, though, and here you have the instance of a gap, to find information from the later stage in Tivy's life when she was moved to build the church. But I was very lucky again and happened upon that after months of digging. So there I felt very fortunate. St. Agatha's, Definiak Springs, which I believe was the last or second to last church to be added to the pantheon that was included in the book, also had a wonderful, rich, and well documented history and their historian was extremely helpful to me and met me on the parish porch, the parish hall porch, which is actually a historic home adjacent to the church, and turned this information over, and it was like manna from heaven. But others were much more difficult. St. Mary's in Madison had lost its early historical records in a fire, so there was no recovering those. What did I do? I hope it wasn't too apparent in the chapter. I used the town's history from that point, and I knew that some of the most prominent members of the town were involved in the church, and I knew which priests had supported the early congregation. So I sort of wove that together, and hopefully nobody noticed. But that's exactly the kind of thing that you're describing, where I had to punt a little bit or improvise.
The and then of course this is all about the architecture, too, as well as the stories behind the buildings. What did you discover about the craftsmen in each of these communities? Because I have been privy on several of your talks, especially with St. Mary's and the others, and living in Green Cove Springs, uh, knowing how hard it was, people coming down the rivers. And we've heard stories that they were on the boats and they'd step off the boats, maybe uh, have a little something to drink and lose the boat and have to work on a carpenter job at church to make a little money to get back on the boat. So what did you learn about those people as well as the priests and the people that were raising the monies like uh, to build these churches?
Well, there were many happy discoveries in this journey, and that was easily one of the best things about it. One was discovering that some of the um, artisans who worked on these churches, and with that term I would include the builders and even the architects, were famous people, people known for their other works. An example would be to use St. Mary's, Green Cove Springs as an example. Um, the fact that the builder of that church built all of Henry Flagler's hotels from the Ponce de Leon all the way down to the breakers. Well, that's a remarkably fun fact. And yet, I think the thing that was the most uh, moving or compelling was to discover that as to all of them, and in many cases, the identities of the workers it are unknown, but they all ascribe to a principle that I think may be a little lost on us for our public buildings today. And that's probably best expressed by the saying attributed correctly to John Ruskin: when we think to build, let us think that we build forever. They were not interested in makeshift work. They were building uh, works to last, and particularly for sacred architecture, they thought that that was appropriate. And interestingly enough, when St. Mary's in Green Cove Springs had its churchyard flooded in 2017 after Hurricane Irma, the waters completely surrounded the church. A parishioner sent me a kind of a grainy video. It was a bouncy. It was probably still windy when it was taken, and the church was completely surrounded by water. It looked, as I said in the book, it looked for all the world like a Slovenian castle in a lake. Um, and the waters came up and lapped the undersides of the floorboards. But the church seems to have been set at its height presciently because they then receded. The waters receded without doing anything other than minimal damage. And again, that might be an instance of thinking to build forever. Yes, the church was built on the water, very close to the St. John's, but maybe it entered their minds that there could be flooding, and they set it at a particular height. Another quick example is St. Luke's over in the community of Courtney on Merritt Island was struck by Hurricane Matthew. It's been through many a hurricane, and its spire was wrenched a little bit. It lost some of its shingles, but it made it through. It was built to last. And then a last example is Christ Church in Fort Meade. They had the huge main beam that lies under the third pew in the ground. They had it examined at one point for structural soundness. It was quite sound, thank you. But they discovered something. They discovered that that beam rested on a huge boulder of karst, which is a rock found in Florida, usually not at the surface. It is found at the surface in the Peace River about a mile away, but not found there. They had gone to the trouble of loading that boulder of karst rock into a wagon, dragging it a mile to the church, and then resting their main beam, upon which the entire church would be built, on that rock. Adhering to scripture, they literally built their church upon a rock. It was built to last.
Oh, Jonathan, what stories? What stories? Um, what emotions were strongest with you as you wrote this book? Um,
Emotions, what emotions were strongest as I worked or as we worked? I would say, and I touched on this for a moment, happiness, the joy of uh, of discovery. There was a later moment of elation after publication. Perhaps we'll touch on that later. But I would say the joy, found in the process. Not that it was all joy. There was a lot of drudgery, a lot of really hard work. The entire writing process took 17 years. Phil was the soul of patience. um, and apart from that, I would say surprise was another emotion. Surprise at little discoveries. One of the foremost of which was discovering that each of us, Phil and I, had a personal, in fact, more than one, personal connections to these churches. We had no idea of that going in. Now, I mentioned that two of the churches, not in the book, but two Carpenter Gothic churches were in our past, but two in the book turned out to be, in fact, more than two, turned out to be directly in our past. One of Phil's ancestors was responsible for the construction of one of the churches, and he has an ancestor who was one of the first rectors at another of the churches. He didn't know that. I mean, and to discover that after you've begun working on this book was really, really remarkable. I discovered that my paternal grandfather, whom I mentioned was a priest, had served as interim rector at St. Andrews, Fort Pierce, for 9 months in 1925. Before it was later moved in the 1950s to become Holy Apostles in Satellite Beach. It's in the book. It's one of the last churches in the book. I had no idea, and learned that from my dad as I worked on the book. That's a fairly astounding fact. And when my dad was in his late 90s, I took him over to see it. He hadn't seen it since he was 9 years old. And to see him walk into it, recognize it, even in its new location, and walk up to the pew where he had sat with his siblings and his mother to listen to his father preach in Fort Pierce in 1925 was quite a moving experience. So yes, lots of emotions along the way. I'm making it sound as though it were all um, fireworks and cherries. It was not. There was a lot of routine and difficult work. But drudgery doesn't make for good stories in particular. But I need to signal every now and then there was a great deal of that too.
Um, did you have any moments, and I think you just alluded to one, but as you are now a historian, basically, really, a historical writer, did you have any moments when that history, other than that personal, side of it, when that history just came alive to you, when you were standing someplace, or that, because you and I have spoken a lot about what this book has done, and immediately as a historian, I I recognize that these books and these stories are Florida portals. I mean, they really truly are. They are, when we sit and listen to you talk and about the communities that are involved in the making and the living and the breathing of these churches, was anyone just, aha, this is, I'm in history. This is my moment.
Yes, they all were increasingly with every discovery we made, time portals, portals into Florida's past. History can be so dry if it's a succession of dates and facts, and this really made history come alive, even for two fellows, for whom history is interesting to begin with. But particular examples where it just suddenly came alive, in the moment. Um, we were told at St. James in Leesburg that that the that after their church, their Carpenter Gothic church, was partially burned in a fire in 1947, that the floorboards were still structurally sound. And so what they did is they pulled them up and turned them over and nailed them back down. They had been seared black, of course. And we asked if they had any documentation of that. Um, and they said no, but that's what we've always been told. And there was nobody around who could confirm it, directly as a firsthand account. And we hit upon the idea of asking them if we could poke around under the church. If we could get down under there and take a look. Well, we went down. Conveniently, they had some steps that led down to a little opening, and they had warned us. They said, "Hey, look, we're not responsible for anything you encounter down there." And maybe they meant a raccoon. I'm not sure what they had in mind. But we went down there and opened the little door. They gave us a rusty key, and in we went, completely black, and turned on our phone flashlights. And sure enough, the floorboards were seared as black as night. They were clearly charred. It was really a moment when the past, became the present. Um, Another example, we went once to St. Paul's, Federal Point, and as sometimes happened, we had not gotten a call back from whoever we tried to reach. A lot of these churches are not um, uh, you extraordinarily active with large congregations. In fact, at Emmanuel at Willaca, they might, when last I heard, have maybe a dozen or 15 people attend on a Sunday. Well, we hadn't gotten a call back from St. Paul's at Federal Point, so we drove out to Federal Point without an appointment. We got there and we were relieved to see a couple of cars in the parking lot, and went to the screen door of the parish hall, and were relieved to see two women in aprons peeling potatoes, as it turned out, for the next day's annual fish fry. And they very agreeably listened to our interest in their church and dried their hands and escorted us over and into the church. And when I asked if they had any early documents, they kindly took me to an old battered filing cabinet and opened the top drawer and allowed me to go through some folders. And imagine my delight when I found a hand copied, not original, but early hand copied a version of a letter to Bishop Young from the founder of that parish, asking for permission to create a mission there and name it St. Paul's. I mean, that was just remarkable. At first, I wasn't sure it wasn't the original, but later realized it was not the original, but a very early handwritten copy. So, I mean, extraordinarily fun finds. This was like a grown-up Easter egg hunt for two native Floridian uh, history buffs who are also Episcopalians.
Well, I know that the connection of history, what connected me was the story that you tell, and I'm probably going to get it wrong, so jump in. And I believe we were in Palatka, and it was the small church there that was way out on the, I mean, we had to go back through the fields to get to it. And we were sitting in that small church, and you were connecting the really kind of connecting the past to the present, which you probably recognize because any woman that is in this group right now that has worked in it, and men too, but really women that have worked in their churches trying to raise money to get stuff, this story appeals to them. We've all had to do it. And having the arts and crafts shows and you know selling. And when you told the story about these guys going in and getting the alligator, the eggs, blowing and then decorating them, and then going down to the pier and sitting at that pier and selling those eggs. There wasn't one gal I think that served her church that didn't say, we can resonate with that. And that was when I think that was the moment for me when I really opened up and said, all of these churches are just these are communities. These were living, breathing people that were doing just like we were, trying to keep things going, keep our little bookstore going. How are we going to market this bookstore? What are we going to do? Okay, we don't have alligator eggs, but we have other kinds of stuff to do. What was your sense leading the segue into that? What do you think these churches, what do they teach us about these early Florida communities? What resonates? Because I'm sure there's some common threads there with all of these.
There are, and I'll try to touch on a few things. You know, as you delve into it, as we delved into it, you're struck by their resilience. This was before highways, before hard roads, as they first called them, uh, before mosquito control, before drainage of the swamps. And gradually, you have to take away the things that we take for granted, which is hard to do, and put in their place the challenges that they had to deal with. So tremendous resilience, tremendous devotion to carry them through the challenges. Often these churches were the largest and most significant structures, small as they are. They were the largest, most significant structures to be built by these communities. That says a lot. They're not that today, but they were then. Um, Another thing is how free they were in their time to pursue any avenue of work or project, and how varied their careers were as a result. I'm thinking in particular of an early member of St. Mark's in Palatka, who was a physician,
Mhm.
but apart from being a physician, was a prominent vestryman at the church. And apart from that, served in the Florida Senate. And apart from that, had a business and actually was the first person to dredge the Haulover Canal that connects the Indian River with the Mosquito Lagoon. Today, that would not be possible because of regulation and other probably other factors as well. But it's true that they were challenged, but they had that freedom to pursue a lot of different avenues. So I would say their energy and the variety of their pursuits is very, very striking. You touched on the story of the eggs. They were creative. That speaks to their creativity and fundraising. These churches often cost anywhere from $300 to maybe $1,200 to build. A lot of money back then, depending on how much was donated. But then the churches usually would have to stop. They'd have to pause and gather their financial breath before paying for the stained glass windows, which would cost as much as the church had cost, usually as much as $1,000. Well, St. Paul's and Federal Point, which you mentioned, had to cover their window openings with canvas for a little while because they didn't have stained glass yet. And they covered them, of course, to keep out insects and birds and rain. And they pulled the canvas aside for services. Well, how did they wind up raising the money for the windows that stand in the church to this day? And that's what makes it fun to be there and point out how the money for these very windows was raised. They went into the nearby swamp and they went to the many alligators' nests, and they raided the nests for their eggs, the large eggs. They took them back, they drained them through pinholes, they painted them with intricate Florida landscapes, tied bows on them, and then sold them for 25 cents each to the steamboat tourists that came daily to their landing. That's how all the money for those windows was raised. So the last thing that I want to mention, if I may, Sandy, is something that you touched on, and that is the role of women in connection with these churches. I have to mention that because I mentioned that one of the emotions was surprise in working on the book. I was astonished to learn the extent to which these churches were the product of the vision and the work of women. I was not prepared for that. Our received wisdom about Victorian women, clad from wrist to ankle, usually in black, is that they were repressed and that they were reticent and passive. That is not how they saw themselves. They went to college in double the numbers of their mothers. They delayed marrying. They delayed having children. And those who had the means, and increasingly they did because the Gilded Age created what became the middle class in America, would engage domestic help. And that freed them for the first time uh, to have the time to devote to community pursuits and charitable work, literary societies, societies devoted um, to eventually to suffrage, the suffrage movement, but societies opposing child labor, for example, societies with concern for the overuse of alcohol, so abstinence, things of that nature. But of course, societies or church groups or their own churches, they became very prominent in supporting churches, and more than half of the churches in the book were dreamt of, and the fundraising was led, and even the construction was overseen by women. Really a striking fact, and I have a passage or a section in the introduction devoted to that subject.
Okay, well, we're going to wrap up our time. This has just been phenomenal, but we were going to wrap our time up with a couple of questions because one of the things, as you know me, you and I have discussed this too, that my passion is with preservation, and I just think about what's happening and what could happen, even with our little St. Margaret's Church that we're just so fond of in this, in our diocese. What, okay, what is the greatest preservation challenge? And you can touch on other preservation issues if you want to. I had several questions that I put towards you on preservation, but let's just kind of touch on that because everybody that is on this Zoom needs to realize that these churches are made of wood, and they are in Florida. And I live in a wood house, and I can tell you exactly what it takes to maintain wood in Florida. Uh, what what do you see as in Phil, you too? Maybe you want to chime in on this as a photographer. As y'all did this, what was the kernel inside your souls about preservation?
Well, Sandy, you're right. They're all made of wood, and wood is ultimately perishable, even if it's heart pine and very durable. I like to point out that St. Mark's Palatka was being hammered together on the St. John's there when Abraham Lincoln was still a prairie lawyer. That's a long time for a structure of wood to stand, particularly in a in a climate like ours that is not altogether hospitable to structures made of wood. But what is the greatest preservation challenge today? I would say that fitting the churches to the needs and expectations of present day congregations is one, and they have taken varied approaches to that. They have expanded. St. Paul's Federal Point is an example where they lengthened the nave, which is a common strategy. Sometimes they're converted to a chapel. St. Luke's in Courtney on Merritt Island would be an example where they built a larger main structure. Some have been donated and relocated to a startup congregation, Holy Apostles, Satellite Beach. Some have been moved to public parks or museums and have become event venues. Beaches Museum Chapel on Jacksonville Beach and San Marco Preservation Hall near San Marco Square in Fletcher Park in Jacksonville would be examples of that. So they've had to contend, and I have a passage in the book about this too. It's a little as though they're like Dorothy, waking up in Oz and rubbing their eyes in disbelief because they've come from the frontier to one of the most populous and fastest growing states in the nation. How do they vie with the modern uh, evangelical megachurch? I mean, how do they do that exactly? They don't even have bathrooms. It would not it did not befit the Victorian mind to have the needs of the flesh, housed in the same structure as as was devoted to the spirit. I mean, that would not have been appropriate. They didn't even have latrines or outhouses in the churchyards. So that's been difficult for them. But I think the most important part of the message, and I devote the books afterward to this, is is that there's a temptation to do things that are makeshift in order to suit the present day needs. And usually makeshift alterations are later regretted. An example might be, covering floors, hardwood pine floors with wall-to-wall carpeting. That might suit the moment, but it's later regretted, typically. So I think the for old buildings such as these, uh, and maybe particularly sacred ones, loyalty to original architectural values and faithful restorations are the ones that usually meet lasting approval, whereas embellishments and improvements are often later regretted.
Oh, beautiful, beautifully. Well, I'll tell you what, this is one of the best. Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you, Phil, for our rich and meaningful conversation today. And I think as we go back and perhaps, and I certainly will take a look at this when as and your words and your images have given us just a deeper appreciation for the churches that shape our Florida landscape. And also for the stories. I always say every building has a story, and for the stories and the craftsmanship that continue to inspire us. But before we close, I want to remind everyone that we have copies of the Spires of the Sun available to purchase through the St. John's Cathedral Bookstore and Gift Shop. And we have a special. I know after you've listened to this, but if you haven't purchased a book, you'll want to. And we have a special sale on for $45. So get it while it's hot. And I would certainly think that for those of you that have anybody in your family that is a history buff or an architectural buff or an Episcopalian buff or or a Florida buff, This would be a absolute, it's not a stocking stuffer by any means, but it is an actual a gift for a lifetime. And I would certainly recommend you kind of looking at it. And of course, as Jonathan says, these guys got nothing for this in the way except um, for giving it this gift to us. Both of you have given the Episcopal Church, you've given the communities of Florida, and you've given Florida history buffs just the most beautiful gift that for Christmas and for all time, and we really appreciate it. And I would remind you that our bookstore continues to offer a full calendar of events through the years. We have the first Monday book club. We have our Art at Noon, which is the backstory is a part of. This is a program that we support in our community and in our state and in our nation, art, music, literature, and faith. We have these wonderful author talks and conversations. We do road trips, and we've got one coming up. And the way you find out about this is we have this great um, website, our book website. All of the events, you scroll down and they're listed under events. We've got one coming up, and I'm going to let Catherine tell you about it in a minute. Um, we have also the art walks around the city. We're going to be doing one on December the 16th. And the title of that one is A Light in the Darkness, an Advent. Um, it's an Advent looking at the stained glass windows in our church. So you want to come and see that as we talk about the beautiful stained glass windows in the cathedral. Um, Also, on our Facebook page, we do a daily reflection with Dean Cates devotionals. The one today is really, I hope most of you will tune in and look at it. She did a wonderful devotion about the river and the tree at the end of Revelation, and the sculpture that we put up today and the music that goes with it and reflects that is just glorious. So hopefully that you will come and you will take advantage of all of these wonderful programs. Thank you for joining us today. Well, we are ever so grateful. Every single penny that you spend with us in the bookstore goes to support something, and in the cathedral and outside the cathedral. We look forward to seeing you at our next Artist and Backstory. Catherine, do you have anything to say as we close out this wonderful program? Thanks again, guys.
Yes, thank you, Sandy, and thank you, Jonathan and Phil, for being with us today. This was wonderful. Couple of events in December. December 3rd, if you want to make the drive to Fernandina Beach, Jonathan will be doing an author talk at the Amelia Island Historical Museum. It's a lunch and learn program, and info is on our website about that. And that's going to be a different talk. If you've heard him speak before, it's going to have a little more of a focus on that area, and in particular, the architect, Robert Schuyler. So that ought to be very interesting. The other event that Sandy referenced is going to be an Art at Noon event, and it's going to be on Tuesday, December 16th. We'll gather at the bookstore about 11:15, and then tour the stained glass of St. John's Cathedral from 11:30 to 12:30. And then we're going to go to lunch in San Marco. So we'll have some info that we'll put up on the website for that. And as Sandy said, shop for a cause this Christmas. We have a lot of great stuff, including this wonderful book, Spires in the Sun, and all of the proceeds, the net proceeds from the sale of Spires. The author and the photographer have donated their royalties and everything else. And so all of it goes to Episcopal Outreach Ministries. So just another word about that. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you, Catherine.
You.